Welcome, wanderers of the dark, to echoes from the campfire, where whispered tales twist into nightmares, and every flicker of firelight hides a story waiting to consume you. Here, legends are reborn, fears take shape, and the echoes of the past refuse to stay buried. Gather close, but beware. Some stories don't just end, they linger. Are you ready to listen? Tonight, the Apocryphal Collective presents The Fog Collector.
The fog rolled in overnight, thick and impenetrable, transforming the small town of Briar Glen into an eerie, otherworldly landscape. By morning, it hung in the air like a living thing, swallowing up entire streets and leaving the world beyond one's doorstep an indistinct blur. At first, the townsfolk thought it was just another weather anomaly. After all, Briar Glen sat nestled in a valley prone to peculiar atmospheric phenomena. But as the hours stretched on, the fog revealed its sinister nature. The first to vanish was Mrs. Holloway, the elderly librarian who lived alone at the end of Elm Street. Her neighbor, James, had watched her step out to retrieve her morning paper, only to dissolve into the mist after a few steps. When he rushed to investigate, all he found was her shadow, perfectly etched into the concrete like a dark, ghostly stain. He screamed until other neighbors arrived, their faces pale as they stood around the shadow that should not exist. By midday, the news had spread through the town. Phones rang incessantly, and panic grew. The fog, silent, unmoving, and unnaturally cold, seemed to be alive. It clung to the town, trapping everyone inside. The mayor attempted to calm the situation, but his reassurances rang hollow when more people began to disappear. A jogger, a delivery driver, a pair of teenagers foolish enough to dare each other to step into the thickest parts of the fog, all vanished, leaving behind only their shadows. By the second day, fear gripped Briar Glen like a vice. Windows were boarded up, doors locked and barricaded. Families huddled together in their homes, too terrified to venture outside. The fog pressed against the windows like a predator stalking its prey, its presence oppressive and unyielding. Every so often, someone would hear faint whispers coming from within the mist, but no one dared to investigate. The whispers were neither male nor female, neither young nor old. They were just there, threading through the silence like an unspoken threat. Evelyn Carter, a 17-year-old high school senior, stared out the window of her bedroom, her breath fogging the glass. She'd been texting her best friend, Mia, late into the night before the fog arrived, but now her messages went unanswered. Mia's house was only a few blocks away, but it might as well have been on another planet. Evelyn's parents had forbidden her from going outside, and even if they hadn't, she wasn't sure she'd have the courage to face the unnatural mist.
Do you think it's some kind of government experiment?
Her father muttered at the dinner table that evening, his voice tight with stress.
Don't be ridiculous.
Her mother snapped.
This isn't a movie. It's probably some freak weather event.
Weather doesn't make people disappear.
Evelyn said quietly. Her parents exchanged a glance but didn't respond. The silence that followed was heavy, punctuated only by the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the house settling. That night, Evelyn couldn't sleep. The fog seemed closer than ever, pressing against her window like a living thing. She lay in bed, clutching her phone, scrolling through social media posts from other townsfolk. Most were just as scared and confused as she was. Some speculated about supernatural forces, others about chemical leaks or secret military tests. No one had answers. At 2:13 a.m., her phone buzzed. A new message from an unknown number lit up the screen.
Come outside.
Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. She stared at the message, her mind racing. Who would send something like that? Her fingers hovered over the keyboard before she managed to type a response.
Who is this?
No reply came. She stared at her phone for what felt like hours, the silence in her room broken only by the faint hum of the fog. Finally, exhaustion overcame her, and she drifted into a restless sleep. When Evelyn woke, it was to the sound of someone sobbing. It was faint but distinct, coming from outside her window. Her heart raced as she crept to the glass and peered out. The fog was thicker than ever, an unbroken sea of white that obscured everything beyond her yard. But the sobbing continued, growing louder, more desperate.
Mia?
Evelyn whispered, her breath fogging the glass. There was no answer, only the sound of crying, now interspersed with whispered words she couldn't quite make out. Against her better judgment, she grabbed a flashlight and crept downstairs. Her parents were asleep and the house was silent. She hesitated at the front door, her hand hovering over the lock.
Don't do this.
She whispered to herself, but the sobbing continued, and she couldn't ignore it. Taking a deep breath, she unlocked the door and stepped outside. The cold was the first thing she noticed. It was a biting, unnatural chill that seemed to seep into her bones. She shone the flashlight into the fog, the beam barely penetrating the dense mist. The sobbing was louder now, coming from somewhere to her left. She took a tentative step forward, then another. Her heart pounded in her chest as she called out,
Mia, is that you?
The sobbing stopped. Evelyn froze, her breath catching in her throat. The silence was deafening, the kind that felt like the world holding its breath. And then, from somewhere deep within the fog, she heard a voice.
Evelyn.
It was faint but unmistakable. Her name spoken in a whisper that sent shivers down her spine. She turned in a slow circle, the flashlight shaking in her hand. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice trembling. The fog seemed to shift around her, swirling like a living thing. Shadows moved at the edges of her vision, flickering in and out of existence. The voice came again, closer this time.
Evelyn, help me.
The figure whispered, her voice fractured and broken.
Please.
Before Evelyn could respond, the figure dissolved into the mist, leaving behind nothing but an eerie silence. Evelyn stood there for what felt like an eternity before her legs finally obeyed her. She turned and bolted back to the house, slamming the door shut behind her. Her parents found her huddled on the floor the next morning, clutching the flashlight and muttering about the fog. They didn't believe her story, chalking it up to a bad dream. But Evelyn knew what she'd seen, and she knew the fog wasn't just a weather phenomenon. It was alive, and it wanted something. The days that followed were a blur. More people vanished, their shadows etched into the ground like eerie memorials. The whispers grew louder, more persistent, and the fog seemed to tighten its grip on the town. Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching her, waiting for her to step outside again. One night, as the fog pressed against her window, she received another message on her phone.
It's not over.
She stared at the screen, her heart pounding. She didn't know who or what was sending the messages, but one thing was clear. The fog wasn't finished with her, and she wasn't sure she'd survive its next move. Becoming frustrated, Evelyn decided she couldn't wait any longer. Armed with her flashlight, a kitchen knife, and a makeshift map of the streets she'd drawn from memory, she stepped out into the fog. The air seemed to thrum with energy, as if the fog itself was aware of her presence. Every step felt heavier, as though the ground were pulling her down. The whispers started almost immediately. Her name, repeated over and over, weaving through the dense air like a sinister lullaby.
Evelyn, Evelyn, Evelyn.
She followed the faint sound of sobbing again, the same desperate cry she'd heard before. As she walked, the shadows in the fog grew darker, more defined. Shapes that looked almost human shifted in the periphery of her vision, but when she turned to look, they vanished. Finally, she reached the edge of town, or what should have been the edge. The road she knew led to the highway was gone, replaced by an endless expanse of white. And in the center of the fog stood a figure. This time it was unmistakable.
Mia?
Evelyn called, her voice trembling. The figure turned, and for a moment Evelyn's heart leapt. It was Mia, or at least it looked like her. But as Mia stepped closer, Evelyn saw the unnatural pallor of her skin, the emptiness in her eyes.
You shouldn't have come.
Mia said, her voice layered with an otherworldly echo.
It's too late.
Evelyn took a step back.
Mia, what happened to you?
Before Mia could answer, the fog surged forward, and Evelyn was swallowed whole, plummeting into an endless void of obsidian.
We've been waiting for you, Evelyn.
The fire dims, but the echoes remain. If you've enjoyed this tale, let the darkness know. Like, subscribe, and step deeper into the unknown. Until next time, keep the fire burning, because in the silence the stories are always waiting.